In 1914, a drill broke through a lakebed in western Venezuela and oil came up with it. Not a trickle. A gusher, black and enormous, visible for miles. Within a decade, foreign companies had mapped the country's subsoil more carefully than its own government had mapped its roads. By 1950, Venezuela had the highest per capita income in Latin America. It had more paved roads per square kilometer than most of South America combined. Families in Caracas drove American cars, shopped in European boutiques, and sent their children to study in Paris. The oil money didn't just pay for comfort, it replaced the entire question of how a country builds itself. No need to develop agriculture. No need to build a manufacturing base. The state would pump, sell, collect, and distribute. Everything else would be imported. Economists have a name for what follows when a country's entire logic is organized around one export. They call it the resource curse. But in Venezuela in the 1950s, nobody was using that language. The money felt permanent. In 1958, a military dictatorship fell, and a formal democracy took its place. The new system, called Puntofijismo, was a power-sharing agreement between the two dominant parties. They agreed to rotate control and divide the state's oil revenues between themselves. For 3 decades it worked, by the measure of elections held and transfers of power completed. But what it produced was a government class that treated the petroleum company as a personal budget line. PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, was founded in 1976 when the government nationalized the oil industry. It was, for a time, one of the most professionally managed state oil companies in the world. Its engineers were trained abroad, its accounts were audited, its operations ran separately from the political machinery above it. The problem was the gap between what PDVSA produced and what the government promised. In the 1970s, oil prices surged. The government borrowed against future oil income. It expanded payrolls, subsidized food, built housing, promised pensions. When oil prices collapsed in the early 1980s, those promises didn't collapse with them. The debt stayed, the subsidies stayed, the government's spending logic stayed. Between 1983 and 1998, Venezuelan real wages fell by roughly 50%. The bolívar, Venezuela's currency, was devalued repeatedly. Not once as a correction, but as a pattern. By the late 1980s, Venezuela looked from the outside like a functioning democracy. From the inside, it was a country where the political class had drifted so far from ordinary life that the connection between them had become purely formal. In February 1989, the government announced it would raise fuel prices and cut subsidies, following an IMF austerity package. Within days, Caracas was burning. Riots spread to 12 cities. The army was ordered into the streets. The official death toll was around 300. Independent investigators put it higher, some estimates reaching into the thousands. The event is called the Caracazo. It didn't end the democracy, but it broke something in the relationship between the population and the system that governed them. 3 years later, a lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chavez attempted a military coup. He failed. He was arrested, taken on television, and given a brief moment to speak. He said the coup had failed, for now. 2 words in Spanish, por ahora. Those 2 words made him famous. They made him sound like a man with more planned. In 1994, he was pardoned. In 1998, he ran for president. He ran against the existing system, against Puntofijismo, against the political elite that had spent 4 decades treating oil revenue as their operating budget. He won with 56% of the vote. It wasn't irrational. The system he replaced had real failures. The poverty was real. The corruption was documented. The broken promises were lived experience. Chavez arrived with something the old parties had long since exhausted, the credibility of not yet having governed. The oil price in early 1999, when he took office, was around $10 per barrel. His budget assumptions were tight. His initial policy moves were cautious enough to surprise observers who had expected something more radical. What he built first was a new constitution pushed through a constituent assembly, approved by referendum in December 1999. It was a genuine document in some ways. It added social rights, extended protections, reformed the judiciary on paper. It also concentrated executive power in ways the old constitution had not. The president gained the ability to dissolve the legislature under certain conditions. The military was brought under closer presidential command. Term limits were extended. The mechanisms for removing a president were made more difficult to use. None of this was invisible. Constitutional scholars noted it. Opposition leaders raised it. But in 1999, in a country that had just spent 4 decades watching a 2-party elite divide oil money among itself, procedural warnings about executive overreach were not the most compelling argument in the room. By 2003, oil prices had begun to climb. By 2005, A barrel of Venezuelan crude was worth 4 times what it had been when Chavez was inaugurated. The government launched a series of social programs called misiones, missions. Literacy programs, subsidized food markets, free health clinics, staffed partly by Cuban doctors, community universities. The programs were real. Millions of Venezuelans gained access to services they had not had before. Poverty rates fell. Child mortality declined. Enrollment in primary and secondary education went up. These numbers are not disputed. The question economists asked, even those sympathetic to the goals, was structural. The misiones were funded almost entirely by oil revenue. They had no independent fiscal base. The Cuban doctors were paid in oil shipments, not in currency that Venezuela could freely deploy. PDVSA was now being used to fund social policy directly, which meant its reinvestment budget, the money needed to maintain wells, upgrade equipment, and develop new fields, was being squeezed. An oil company that stops reinvesting doesn't collapse immediately, it declines slowly. Production figures that should have grown instead began to flatten, then to dip. Engineers who had spent careers at PDVSA watched resources redirected and timelines slipped. Some raised concerns internally, some left. A group of PDVSA managers joined a broader strike in 2002 and 2003. Chavez responded by firing approximately 18,000 PDVSA employees, nearly half the company's professional workforce. Their replacements were often chosen for political loyalty rather than technical experience. The institutional knowledge inside PDVSA, decades of it, walked out with the engineers who were dismissed. That decision, made in 2003, would not fully register in production numbers for years. That is the nature of deferred infrastructure damage. It doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. When Chavez died in March 2013, the oil price was still above $90 a barrel. His chosen successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a government whose entire architecture had been built around that number staying high. Maduro was not Chavez. He didn't have the political instinct, the physical charisma, or the coalition of genuine loyalty that had kept Chavez in power through coups, strikes, and referendums. What he had was the apparatus, the military relationships, the party structure, the control over courts and electoral authority. And for a short time the oil price held, and the problems that had been accumulating stayed below the surface. In mid-2014, global oil prices began to fall. By early 2016, a barrel of Venezuelan crude was worth less than $30. For most oil-exporting nations, that was a serious budget problem. For Venezuela, it was a structural emergency. The government was already running a fiscal deficit. It was already printing money to cover the gap between revenue and obligation. When the oil income fell, it didn't cut spending proportionally, it printed more. The money supply expanded, prices rose. The government responded to rising prices with price controls. When vendors couldn't sell at the controlled price and cover their costs, they stopped selling. Shelves in state-run markets emptied first, then private supermarkets, then pharmacies. By 2016, Venezuelans were spending hours each week in queues for flour, for cooking oil, for blood pressure medication, for infant formula. The lines became one of the most reported images of the crisis, but they were a symptom, not the cause. The cause was a monetary system being destroyed from the inside, deliberately and incrementally, by a government that had no other mechanism for covering its obligations. Inflation in 2016 was approximately 254%, according to the opposition-controlled National Assembly. The government had stopped publishing official figures. By 2018, independent economists estimated annualized inflation at over 1 million%. A cup of coffee that cost 1 bolivar in 2012 cost roughly 10 million bolivars by 2018. The currency was redenominated. Zeros were removed from the bills, new notes were printed, and then the new notes also lost value within months. Venezuelans stopped saving in bolivars. They stopped pricing anything in bolivars if they could help it. Dollars became the functional currency of daily transactions, even as the government officially maintained that the bolivar was the national currency. In the wealthy parts of Caracas, dollar payments moved quietly through informal exchanges. In the poorest neighborhoods, there were no dollars to exchange. The people with the least formal access to hard currency bore the sharpest edge of the collapse. Hospital systems had been deteriorating since the mid-2000s. By 2016, they were operating without basic supplies. Doctors reported performing surgeries without anesthesia. Neonatal wards ran without the equipment needed to keep premature infants alive. A study published in The Lancet in 2018 found that maternal mortality in Venezuela had increased by approximately 65% between 2015 and 2016 alone. These are not disputed figures. They are the kind of numbers that appear in medical literature, not political arguments. The malnutrition surveys that did exist, conducted by universities and NGOs operating inside Venezuela, documented severe acute malnutrition in children across multiple states. The government called these surveys politically motivated. It largely stopped allowing independent health data to be collected or published. What it couldn't stop was the movement of people. Beginning around 2015, Venezuelans started leaving in numbers that had no precedent in the country's history. Not the middle-class emigration that had been happening since the early 2000s. Professionals, engineers, doctors moving to Spain or the United States. This was different. This was families crossing the border on foot into Colombia, carrying what they could. By 2023, the United Nations estimated that more than 7 million Venezuelans had left the country, roughly 1 in 5 of the entire population. It became the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere in recorded history. Colombia absorbed the largest share, then Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Brazil, then the United States. The people leaving were not primarily political dissidents. They were people who could no longer feed their children on what they earned. The Maduro government's response to the political crisis that accompanied the economic one was not reform, it was consolidation. When the opposition won a legislative supermajority in 2015, the government created a parallel legislative body, the Constituent Assembly, and transferred power to it. When courts ruled against the government, judges were replaced. When protests broke out in 2017, they were met with a combination of security forces and armed pro-government civilian groups known as colectivos. More than 100 people died in those months of protest. Thousands were detained. The international response was sanctions from the United States, the European Union, and others. The sanctions became, for the government, a usable explanation for everything the economy had failed to do. Economists who have studied the sequencing are largely clear. The economic collapse preceded the most significant sanctions by years. The sanctions made things worse at the margins. They did not cause what had already happened to the bolivar, to PDVSA, to the food supply. But the narrative served its purpose domestically. External pressure, external blame, external enemies. Maduro remained in office. As of 2024, he remains in office, having contested elections whose results international observers refused to certify. The opposition candidate in the July 2024 election, Edmundo Gonzalez, was officially declared the loser. His campaign and numerous independent observers, including the Carter Center, concluded that the government had not provided credible evidence for its claimed result. Gonzalez went into exile. The government issued an arrest warrant for him. Venezuela's oil production, which had reached around 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s, had fallen to roughly 700,000 barrels per day by 2020. Some recovery has occurred since, partly through workarounds on U.S. sanctions. The figure as of recent reporting sits below 1.5 million barrels. The infrastructure that was not maintained in the Chavez years, the engineers who were fired in 2003, the reinvestment that was redirected to social spending. These decisions compounded over 2 decades. It is worth being careful here. Sources on Venezuela vary significantly. Government figures have been withheld or contested. Opposition figures have their own incentives. Independent researchers have faced obstruction. The broad arc, oil dependency, institutional erosion, monetary collapse, mass displacement, is not seriously disputed among economists who study it. The precise numbers, the attributions of specific decisions, the debate over how much was ideology and how much was incompetence, those remain genuinely contested. What Venezuela reveals, at its core, is not simply the story of one government's failures. It is the story of what happens when a state spends decades mistaking revenue for development, when the income from the ground is used to replace the harder project of building institutions, diversifying the economy, and maintaining the systems that carry a country through bad years. The oil was always finite, the prices were always going to move. What Venezuela built on top of that oil, the subsidies, the promises, the political loyalty purchased with petroleum income, had no independent foundation. When the price fell, there was nothing underneath it. The 7 million people who left didn't leave because of a single decision or a single leader. They left because a system that had been substituting oil money for genuine economic development for 60 years finally ran out of room to hide what it had never built. That is the mechanism. That is what lasted longest. And that is what any country sitting on a single dominant resource is, in some quiet way, still living with.